Ganesh, Neha. So what we've tried to do is actually look at the galaxy, without any notion, just looking at it. That was the first exercise which we tried to do. What you realize is there are many versions of the galaxy. Like this one, the blue one, is from the master plan document. This one is the model in the town hall. This one, I think, was the previous model which was in the town hall, the small one which is now in New York. Yeah. So what you see is from each one, there is a slight variation from one to the other. Yeah. But when we look at it, we always call it the galaxy. But it changes, yeah. And that was something it was good insight for us that, it's more about how you feel about it and what comes through rather than the actual lines. So that was one important insight. And what we've tried to do in this exercise is come up with certain insights which might help the DDP team to hopefully incorporate in their own way. This we feel is very important. This is the geometry or the grid of the galaxy. So what happens is when you look at the line of force here and the line of force there, both of them have a very different geometry. And I think it's very important for us to kind of recognize that. And especially when the line of force comes on the crown, you get these kind of intersections happening. So if you see you have that line of force is one geometry, these line of forces are the other. The cultural zone is 60, 120, 180, that geometry. And then the crown itself is kind of radial geometry. Yeah? And what's interesting for us is the intersections of the geometry when you look at the crown. Yeah? That's where we are right now. Now, what is the crown? I mean, we just took this and colored. So it's actually, when you look at it, it's a string of buildings. When you look at it carefully, more than a string of buildings, it's a building which is a string. Even though it's a town plan problem, I feel whenever I start working on it, it's actually an architectural problem in many ways. Yeah, you have to go really deep in, solve it, come back. So so that insight was, it's not town planning, of course, is important and it's there, but I see it as an architectural, almost a single building. Yeah, single building which many people build over many decades. Yeah, that's the aim. So in the master plan document, you have this kind of amorphous things. So if you see, I think it's
This is the 1969 document.
So it kind of breaks, and even there, this is from the model itself. Where the international zone happens, it kind of breaks. I mean, we've connected it for this particular model, but it's one string. So what comes through to us from this is the edge, which is important. So the crown is not a ring per se as a tire or something like that. Yeah, it's something else. And this, I think, we need to recognize. And the edge is, we feel, very crucial or super important actually. So the next thing after looking, what we did was we actually drew it. Yeah. So what you see here is not the actual galaxy which you saw in the previous slides, but it's something which we kind of took inspiration from that and we did. Yeah. So in a way, this is another galaxy, but it's the same galaxy, but it's another version of it. Yeah. And what we realized is when you do this, it's like when you sketch somebody's face, you see so much. Yeah. So it's the same. When you're here, for instance, and you're coloring this green spot, you think, what is in the green spot? Why am I coloring it? What tree is this? All those things kind of come through. Yeah. So the inferences which we kind of drew from this looking and drawing act was, it's a continuous built form, built by different architects over a period of time. And how do you make a single building which different people built and still looks cohesive? So one idea was, if you have to reference your neighbor, that is a given. But what would be more interesting is if you take a palette from one building and when you're designing something next to it, see, for example, this building has 3 materials as a palette. You need to take at least one of this when you do the neighboring building. So once you do that, you get a very cool kind of variation which will automatically happen without really enforcing or giving a rule to somebody. Connections at the roof, I mean, that's pretty obvious when you look at it. It looks like it's all connected. Boundary definition, dynamic crown edge. So this is what we got when we looked at it. And one thing was, you find that it's dense in some parts and it kind of peters down in some. So that's an interesting aspect to kind of hold as well. So now what we're trying to do is take that learning and try to kind of merge or integrate with this. This is what we're trying to do. This is the aim of the project.
So there were two aspects to it. So we were talking about the concept so far, and we're trying to then see the context and somehow try to integrate both and see where it takes us.
Yeah. And our whole presentation, I forgot to tell you, initially we have this whole thing about how we see the galaxy. Then we talk about Darkali. Then we'll talk about the road itself, how we see it. So that's how we've kind of spread it out. So this is an interesting thing. So the crown is about 4.3 kilometers walk. Yeah. And for me, it's very important that when you walk 4.3, you don't get bored. Yeah. So it has to be, there has to be variation. So what I'm saying when I say bored is, there is a certain sense of experience when you walk in, say, Pondi. Yeah. You walk on the street and you have buildings here, different heights maybe, but that's the experience. Yeah. What the crown, at least from looking at it, tells us is, because your space where you walk, yeah, because the road is not very apparent when you look at the galaxy drawing, but we have to assume it's there, or the street, whatever you call it. So when you go through there, you have things above your head, and you go through, and then suddenly you have an open space where you get light, and you go, so a lot of things happening in section. So that is coming from the section, but also from the place where it travels through. Like here, the lines of force are very dense here in the residential zone and in the industrial zone. And then what happens when you go from, the international zone to, say, through Darkali to the industrial zone. And all this which we have, the locations through which we pass in the crown, we have to see them as an asset. Yeah? And that is an asset of experience. That's how we see it right now. So this is a very important drawing for us. So if you take the crown, and when you do the negative of the model, yeah, this is what you get. And this is what is one of the key things which we're trying to integrate in our next slides, is what happens here between the buildings, what's shown as green and blue right now, what are those spaces? Because those are the spaces which actually for us define the crown. The buildings, of course, is an extra layer, but these kind of hold the whole thing together. And this is something which we can do now. We don't need to wait for the money and everything for the buildings to come. You can almost experience the crown today if we do something like this. And actually imagine the buildings also, which might come, 20 years down the line.
So at the moment, we are flipping between context and concept. So from the context of the location, of the zoning, of what's happening on the plan itself, we went back to the concept. Now we go back to the context of it and trying to look at the water streams. We just looked at them and seeing how that concept of the green and blue galaxy can really come on the ground today. Yeah, ideally, all the water bodies, all the water catchments would actually be on the inner side, like so somehow catch it here in a larger catchment pond or here, and then perhaps have overflows on the other side, or have different means of collecting water and get that green and blue infrastructure in. Yeah. So the point of intersection of the natural runoff streams with the crown becomes surface water catchments for reuse after filtration. So it was the emergency of water was made very obvious in the last several weeks. So really catch it and reuse it. Not just gardening, but also flushing and any other domestic purposes. And these would not be the only solution. These would also be a part of a larger multi-pronged water strategy, where harvesting of roof runoff, sewage water reuse like Raj mentioned, then desalinated water network can be a part of a secondary or tertiary or primary, I don't know, and percolation, of course. So everything needs to actually work from what we've seen people speak the last several weeks. So looking at the water streams that come, the one thing that really said, oh my God, they're all going. Where are they all going? they were all sort of going to this one line of force, which happens to be at the meeting point of these water streams, so we would like to call it the line of force of life. So it's an industrial zone inverse line of force that is expressed by carving into the earth rather than really building over it. And this is a tricky image, so water also represents emotion, so I invite you to really look at what that brings out and just notice it.
So what we are trying to do now is, with this whole water being caught along the crown, and the green areas are actually identifying important trees all along the crown, and then asking an expert on trees to say, if I'm to build near this tree, what is the distance I should respect? So that is the input which I think we should get from them, and then create the green and the blue kind of void spaces first. And then to represent the galaxy in white, these are all probably different buildings which will be built over different times, yeah? And each one is probably built by a different architect. But if we have some plan in mind already respecting the blue and the green, this, once it's all done, will all come together to get closer to the galaxy image which we talk about. And what's interesting when you look at something like this is, it's almost you wouldn't know who built what, and which I think is actually pretty cool, yeah? And the roofs connect, the material thing can happen. So it's one strategy, you can say, which we are trying to kind of look into.
There is another thing where when we made the model, we made all these loops, and it's hard to actually put them back in the same way, which is okay, because it'll all change and it'll still kind of be what it is.
So in terms of the points are the green, the blue, the edge, which is important, and the heights, which vary from around 10 meters to 2.5 floors. And then a pedestrian access which goes through, below the buildings actually, and this is the key. The pedestrians are walking below the buildings to go from one place to the other. This point we'll come back to again later, but I think that's a crucial thing in the way we are trying to think of this right now.
So now we want to look at the master plan perspective 2025. And one of the things that we want to really try and do is identifying the need for conservation of historic, ecologically sensitive and aesthetically important areas.
So when you look at the Darkali, this slide basically shows what are the kind of, when you overlay the maps, all the maps together, what happens in the Darkali sanctuary. I think that's the right word for it, sanctuary. So part of Darkali actually is in the international zone. So obviously you'll have the crown of the international zone going till here, till the park, yeah? And then you have the American pavilions happening here. And then on the top you have, of course, the industrial zone, which kind of comes, and I'll use this now, and this is the vocational training band. And then the crown comes and kind of stops at the park here. So one of the things which we will also talk about when we talk about the section is we feel the crown would do many things depending on where it is, yeah? So when it goes through the park, I think the crown would almost float over the park, let's say, yeah? It'll still be the crown, but it's a crown which floats over the park, yeah?
So we want to really look at how the crown holds the forest, which it has a tremendous potential to do. So spatial density versus green density versus social density, which of these are we looking at within that context? So pedestrian access in the sensitive areas along the crown with minimal, low impact, like Glen Market comes here again with structures that touch the earth lightly. Canopy walks and bridges and culverts over the water catchment network can be integrated in the pedestrian access. Now, special building guidelines need to be somehow prepared for the pavilions that are planned in the international zone. So the pavilions of the Americas need to have certain guidelines which are sensitive to the context where they find themselves. Also, the industrial zone line of force that comes, which I had made into a line of force of water, needs to have guidelines which are line of force of life, need to have their own guidelines. And also limiting the proposed building functions to ones like tree care, arboriculture, canopy experience, research, study, seed banks and other green infrastructure. So the users can also kind of work in tandem with where they find themselves in within the larger context of Auroville.
So we feel this is an important model where we can actually demonstrate or use this idea of the crown thinning in different places, yeah? And it can perhaps come through here, where the dense crown here, yeah, but I think it's, kind of peters out here, and then anyway in the park something else happens, and then slowly it comes back again in the industrial zone. So I think using that insight from the galaxy, from looking at the galaxy, one way of adapting it perhaps could be this. And another idea which we were thinking is to let the crown actually from here rise up and go at a height among the trees at 4 meters, 5 meters, whatever. Let it be a bridge which goes through the forest, yeah? So you have to imagine, if you're living anywhere down here in the residential zone, yeah, and you want to go to work at the industrial zone, you'll actually be walking along here and then going on this bridge through trees to go to work, yeah? And we have to see this for that aspect. It is an asset which we all will use, yeah? And so this is just one idea. I mean, you have like the New York High Line, no? That's, I think, about 2 kilometers or something. This is 1/4, 1/5 of it. But I think what we have is much more than what those poor guys at New York have. They'll have to look at buildings. We'll go through higher trees. And we have to come up with a strategy of how the crown kind of becomes less dense and, again becomes very dense over there, is to have perhaps pavilions like this connected with walkways or skyways or treeways, whatever, like just bridges. But basically, when you look down, you have the whole sanctuary, but these could be whatever functions which come up over time, yeah? And the line of force we've attempted, another idea for the line of force is actually like if you get a school, yeah, and the kids actually walk through from the bottom and go up some kind of a bridge, yeah, all the way to the top through trees happening everywhere at different levels. So it's like you're actually experiencing a tree from the bottom to canopy and above canopy. So it becomes an experience by itself. And I think what the line of force are where they are also for a reason, perhaps. You can read it like that. But the important thing for us to do, that's the challenge, is how do you find the right attitude and solution for that in that place? And that is the direction we are coming from, yeah? So this is just one idea. There could be others, but this can be very cool and it can be like very thin steel structures. It's not to say there won't be any impact. Of course there will be, yeah? But we need to be prepared and we need to make the step, some step, and of at least looking at it. And that is what this is. We are still looking at it, what is possible and dreaming, so that perhaps from this something else can come.
So the qualitative, we just tried to dabble a little bit, go into that a little bit. We're trying to understand how integrating the concept with the context offers a very unique opportunity to explore weaving different experiences of moving through the urban environment of the crown. So creating a sense of discovery. Urban environments are places to find inspiration and energy. Designing for cognitive ease, to really feel comfortable knowing where you're going and understanding your environment in a very clear way. Then Shinrin Yoku is the Japanese practice of taking in the forest through a senses, so forest bathing. Through the urban sanctuary. Now people are all over the world are trying to create this within the dense urban jungle, but we have the opportunity to do the opposite. So somehow really grab that moment and try to get, because there's evidence that suggests that natural environments can restore, rejuvenate and boost your attention. So in fact, like Ganesh mentioned, that when you're walking to the industrial zone, for example, you almost go through a process of clearing your head before you get to the task that you're planning to do in the process. And an invitation for mindful movement through planned walkways and cycle paths, a built environment that is planned as a nudge to pause a little bit and bringing in a sense of delight.
So what we did was basically we took the section which we got from TDC and tried to understand it and see what that gives us, yeah? This is, so we can forget, this is what the plan which goes with that section. So you see here, the crown actually, this is all pedestrian, this is covered pedestrian zone, yeah? So the idea is the people are walking through here, yeah? And now the crown, and this is important, is meant to be pedestrian and EV shuttles at 15 kilometers per hour. Yeah? And that's how we should look at it. So I feel we should solve the problem for that first, and then think about what do we do with the motorcycles right now. I think that's something for later. Yeah. So because once you think of both, you got crash basically. Yeah. So here, you have a line of infrastructure here and a line of infrastructure here. Then you have the vehicles here, and then you have the cycle here. So now our kind of take on this is, I said we don't touch the infrastructure, because if that's what's needed, that's what's needed. Yeah. And this, what's going here is basically EV shuttles at 15 kilometers per hour. Yeah. Maybe there are 5, maybe there are 10. Yeah. Our crown is 4.3 kilometers. Yeah. So I think the cyclist can very well maneuver here. We don't need a separate cycling zone. It is one zone. Yeah. And in fact, I can walk there also, even though I'm walking in the pedestrian covered zone. So that is the key. So what happens is, when you think like that, you can actually do this, and you'd come to about 7 meters or even more. Yeah. And what we need to think about is, okay, at some point, it needs to allow for an ambulance or a fire engine. Yeah. And I think it allows. And what we should do is, we should avoid this thinking of a curb. You usually have like a curb here, and then road is slightly depressed. Don't do that. Make everything flat. So people can walk anywhere, and it's just some very, very, very slow moving vehicle which is going through there. So what you get is a stretch of paved area which is going through. Now from this, we'll come to the next slide. Okay, here we try to just see the different sections which happen through the crown. These are just random, just to get an idea actually. This we had done for our first presentation, and we keep improving. And for example, these could happen anywhere along the crown. You'll have the lines of force crossing, but then suddenly where it crosses the park, maybe it just elevated and it goes through over the parks. Yeah. Now to the next slide. This is something which is still in progress, but this is very important also, and this comes from what Omar had touched upon in terms of
shading.
Yeah.
It seems, for example, on the 15th of March, and I think that was May, one of this is May. These are the two areas on the crown which will really require shading and will not have self-shading with the buildings that will come up. So otherwise, most of it, once it's completely built, would have a lot of self-shading involved.
So where this is coming from is, we need to do these studies throughout to actually come up, when you see the crown and you have roofs going over or buildings going over, where should they happen? They should happen where you need them. So it's like finding a reason from it for what needs to happen. So that's kind of the angle we are taking. This was the last slide. And this morning, there's two sketches. This is the plan through the crown, yeah? So let's say this is Matramandar is on this side, yeah? And this is what we just talked about, the paved crown or reduced crown street, let's call it, yeah? So what it does is basically, this whole thing is a pedestrian walkway. Here you have the EV vehicle which is going, and then here you have the services here and here. These are the places where there are existing trees which we locate, and then we mark the space they need and create these kind of courtyards, public spaces. For instance, some can be really large. There is one slide from Henrik from last time, which is very nice, where he talked about different sizes of public spaces. And I think that can come in here very easily. And you have some small, really tiny, medium, large, whatever. And then the water which comes in from there can be held. This can perhaps be roof water which is collected. And importantly, reused. I think that is the key word which we need to nowadays start using. And the black ones, the black represent maybe the columns. And yeah, this is one section of the crown. And when you look through, this we are not so happy, I would say, right now. But this just to see, this is a good exercise. We thought, it's good to make mistakes in the beginning. In paper, at least, it's better to do mistakes.
Finish the mistakes on paper.
Yeah. So, but it gives you an idea where you have a very little built space, but then the section here would be different. When you walk 10 steps, you'll get a different section. Something else will happen. Another 10 steps, something else will happen. So then it becomes really dynamic. Oh, sorry.
Like
Yeah.
that.
Okay, cool. I think I'm almost done, but yeah, yeah, you can read things into such sections, But yeah, that's the idea. That's where we are. Thank you so much.